Professor Gary Anderson from University of Notre Dame, where he's the Hesburgh Professor of Catholic Thought. And even just saying that makes me realize that Gary is one of these people that there's so much kind of things going on, as we say in the UK, under the bonnet, under the hood, I think is probably the expression. In some sense, a professor of Catholic thought, but somebody who has that facility with Hebrew and obviously therefore also the whole kind of Jewish tradition of interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, but also a real good, thorough understanding of the Catholic tradition. And that has manifested itself in some of the great books that he's produced. And one that came to my attention, first of all, was the Genesis of Perfection book on Genesis. So when we had a conference in St. Andrews on Genesis, Gary came, and I think you actually gave the first address. You think you kicked the thing off in a great way. It was super. Maybe the first evening talk, I think it was. And then you had to get to the golf course. And during that time of year in St. Andrews, there was all sorts of time to get out on the golf course. So nobody felt cheated. It was a great time. And I think that's when we first met. And since then, Gary has produced books on things like a great book on sin, again, sort of tracing a kind of history from Bible and sort of out the other end and into tradition, and also the one that he wrote on charity, which is in some sense a companion, feels like a companion volume to that, but the whole idea of the importance of almsgiving in the Christian tradition, and obviously sort of bringing in a really fresh light to these questions, which are questions of ecumenical importance, but also questions of existential importance for Christians. And his latest book is called That I May Dwell Among Them. In fact, it's here, Incarnation and Atonement in the Tabernacle Narrative. So how appropriate for our discussions and our thinking today that Gary is going to lead us this morning. He's somebody whose scholarship is dependable, as his ability to communicate that scholarship is articulate and imaginative, and we're very pleased to have you, Gary. So thank you.
It's an honor to be here. Mark Elliott's one of my favorite people of all time, but many of the faculty here I know very well. I don't know if Joe Mangina is in the audience, so there we go. Chris Seitz and others, Ephraim Radner, a lot of heroes in the school. I did bring this along because partly my talk is an advertisement for the book, but I thought maybe if you like the talk, you put this in your Amazon cart. But then I was thinking maybe it's already in their cart and they'll hear my talk and take it out of their cart. I don't know. I can't prevent that. But as I also say in jest, I don't care if you read the book, just be sure to buy it. But okay. With that in mind, let's go. We're going to begin with the handout. Basically, my talk will follow the handout. If you turn to the second page, I basically will just give you kind of notes in order to follow what I hope is a intelligible progression. So I'd like to begin with the challenge facing the reader of the sacrificial legislation in the Old Testament. And there is no better guide, in my opinion, than Jonathan Klawon's, one of the leading scholars working on the cultic life of ancient Israel. It's text number 1 in the handout. The idea that sacrifice and sin are related in some way has long been recognized and emphasized. Indeed, many discussions of sacrifice are dominated by concerns with guilt, scapegoating, and expiation. It certainly cannot be denied that a number of sacrificial rituals described in Leviticus in particular serve an expiatory role on some level, as our first talk certainly shown. But here's the important sentence. The typical understanding of the way daily sacrifice, here he's translating into English the Hebrew word tamid, the morning and evening sacrifice. The way in which the tamid sacrifice and grave sin are related is, I believe, backward. It's not that the daily sacrifice undoes the damage done by grave transgression. Quite the contrary, grave transgression undoes what the daily sacrifice produces. Maybe just a brief side note here. You can see this represented, not this exact idea, but an analogy to it in Psalm 51, the famous Miserere psalm, in which penitence occurs through the words of contrition of the psalmist, which prepare for the final verses, which is the re-beginning of the sacrificial cultus. So the sacrificial cultus isn't expiating the sin, but actually becomes possible after the sin is removed. That's, I think, in essence, what Clauans is speaking to here with respect to the Tamid. That's not the only way in which sin and sacrifice are related in Hebrew Bible, mind you, but it is an important way that's frequently not given its due. Quite the contrary, so grave transgression undoes what the daily sacrifice produces. And the difference between the two formulations is important. What it boils down to is whether a sacrifice is considered in and of itself a productive act. I think what he means here is there a good internal to itself? That is, if we remove its expiatory role, then what does it do? Those who argue that expiation is at the core of all or most sacrificial rituals ultimately view sacrifice not as something productive or having a good internal to itself, but as a correction or reversal of something that's gone wrong. End of my citation of that selection. Of course, the $64,000 question is what meaning we might give to the sacrificial act if its primary purpose is not expiation. This has been a much discussed question over the past 150 years or so, and there's no commonly accepted answer. The problem here resides in the Bible itself. Scholars have long noted priestly texts give us an abundant detail about how a sacrifice is to be offered, but precious little as to why one would offer it in the first place. Let's begin by attending to the sacrifice that the priestly document puts front and center in its legislation, the morning and evening sacrifice known as the Tamid. Exodus 29, which is the second text on your handout, is the chapter that provides us with the ritual for ordaining Aaron and his sons to the priesthood. It concludes with the sacrifice that will define their priestly office, the Tamid. Its centrality can also be gleaned from the book of Daniel. In that book, the cessation of the Tamid offering stands in for the cessation of the entire sacrificial service. Or as Joseph Blenkinsop has put it, quote, the Tamid sacrifice signified by metonymy, the sacrificial system as a whole. Strikingly, when we come to the offering of the Tamid in Exodus 29, we learn nothing about why the sacrifice should be offered. Rather, all we learn is how to make the sacrifice. So beginning there, Exodus 29:38, now this is what you shall offer on the altar, 2 lambs a year old regularly as Hebrew Tamid, each day, 1 lamb in the morning, the other in the evening, the first lamb, 1/10 of a measure of choice flour, et cetera, down to verse 42. It shall be a regular, that is Tamid burnt offering throughout your generations at the entrance of the tent of meeting before the Lord. Though we can't say with any certainty what is the good internal to this act itself, one thing, though, I think can be said in all fairness, and that is the Tamid sacrifice is not ordered to the removal of sin. This point is rightly emphasized by the late medieval Jewish commentator from Portugal, Abarvanel, who writes, the altar, in respect to the sacrifice, and priestly service in general are not for, primarily, sin offerings. Better that a man should never sin and not have to bring one, but for the Tamid offering, a sacrifice given in thanksgiving to God for what he has done for his people. Now, most modern scholars who attempt to discern the purpose of the Tamid rite do so by appealing to either 1, sacrificial texts outside the priestly source, 2, ancient Near Eastern parallels, or 3, insights made by working field anthropologists. Recently, however, scholars have turned to the story of the binding of Isaac in Genesis for assistance. Though this approach was quite common among early interpreters, and is actually featured prominently in that painting on the first page of your handout that we'll come to at the end, it fell out of favor in the 20th century with the rise of classical source criticism. Yet recent developments in scholarship have led to a reconsideration of this question. In order to appreciate how this works, we must attend to the location of the ordeal that Abraham and Isaac undergo. After God calls Abraham, he commands him to, quote, take your son and go to the land of Moriah, important, and offer him there as a burnt offering. The only other place in the Bible where we find this location is in 2 Chronicles 3, the site where Solomon was to build the house of the Lord, that is at Mount Moriah. An additional point that should not be missed is that both texts, Genesis and then the onset of the Tamid, which occurs in Leviticus 9, highlight the significance of God making himself visible at the location where he will be worshiped. In Genesis, Abraham names the spot where he offered a ram in place of Isaac, the Lord will see, ra'ah, the Hebrew verb, to which the narrator then adds, as it is said to this day, the Lord shall be seen, ra'ah in the passive conjugation. Scholars have long observed that altars were often built to commemorate a theophany that took place there. But the connection between seeing God and building an altar is even more explicit in Genesis 22 and 2 Chronicles 3. In both passages, there's a pun on the verb ra'ah that's associated ultimately with the name Moriah, as though we could derive this noun, not scientifically, but certainly narratively in these texts, from the root ra'ah. According to John Levinson, the purpose of such a linkage is to explain the location for the temple. Mount Moriah has come to mean, quote, the place where God made himself visible. Brother Childs comes at the question from a slightly different direction, and now we're going to be looking at your handout at number 3 on page 3, text B. He notices, and this is on the basis actually of one of his students, I believe I name here Stanley Walters, that 3 of the key words in Genesis 22, ram, burnt offering, and the verb to see or appear, play a prominent role in the foundational texts about Israel's sacrificial cult in Leviticus 8 and 9. Here, reading from the middle of that handout, the effect for the informed reader is that the story of Abraham's uniquely private experience is thus linked canonically to Israel's collective public worship. So Genesis 22 and Leviticus 8 and 9, which are the onset of the Tamid, are joined canonically, Child suggests. And conversely, Israel's sacrifice in Leviticus 8 and 9 is drawn into the theological orbit of Abraham's foundational offering. Quoting then from Genesis, God will provide his own sacrifice. In terms of the Old Testament canon, these 2 witnesses are not conflicting historical ideologies, traceable to different historical sources and not related one to the other, but diverse witnesses within the cult to the same gracious ways of God with Israel. It's not surprising then, here's the value of reading ancient biblical interpreters, it's not surprising, Childs concludes, when the rabbis held that the sacrifices and festivals of Israel were efficacious by virtue of the binding of Isaac. We'll return to that theme in great detail later. Child's view has been enthusiastically endorsed by Georg Steins, Jan Geertz, and Conrad Schmid. Here, turning to the first text on page 3. Schmid's position is the most robust in terms of intertextual connection. He writes, there are some hints that Genesis 22 receives and reworks the priestly texts concerning the sacrificial cult in Leviticus 8 and 9. This is, however, a matter of debate in recent scholarship, as some biblical scholars restrict the vocabulary concerning the sacrifice in Genesis 22 to the technical procedure itself and not to the fuller context of Leviticus 8 and 9. On the other hand, it is striking that apart from Genesis 22 and Leviticus 8 and 9, there are no other instances in the Bible where a burnt offering, olah, and a ram, an appearance of God, are combined. In Arabic, when you want to give authority to a saying of the prophet, you quote the isnad, the chain of transmission. They borrow this from Talmudic discourse, where you get the same thing, and it, of course, happens in modern scholarship as well. You cite the scholars beforehand, but here Schmid doesn't have the proper isnad or proper chain, because Steins gets this from Childs, who got it from Walters. Anyways, mild correction to Schmid. Continuing here with Schmid, given the probable Persian origin of Genesis 22, it is only to be expected that the sacrifice of Abraham's son is described in terms of the current theology, namely that of the priestly texts. End of quote. Because Schmid presumes as a certainty that Genesis 22 was written at the very end of the biblical period, he concludes that its author must have been familiar with the priestly writings. On this view, the Akedah would not be gesturing towards the sacrificial cult in general, but would be referring directly to the rite of the eighth day in Leviticus 9. I personally don't share his certainty about the dating of Genesis 22. I'll say more about that later. I much prefer the approach of Brever Childs, even though for my own argument, if Schmid was right, I'd be on much firmer ground. I just don't believe him. Childs' canonical approach seems to be preferable. Genesis 22 points forward in its larger canonical setting, not at the compositional level, to the beginnings of the biblical cult, and in so doing sets up a framework for understanding biblical sacrifice. As we have noted, the sacrifice that marks the onset of the public cult is the morning and evening tamid. As it was the first sacrifice offered in the morning, all subsequent sacrifices offered during the day were placed upon it. As the last sacrifice of the day offered in the evening, it assured that the divine fire, remember the fire was lit by God Almighty himself, and it was imperative to keep that fire lit. That's what the priests did. In fact, if you look at Maccabees, you'll see worries about retaining that fire, how they did it, who knows, during the period of the exile, so they could relight the altar at the conclusion of the exile. It was a divine fire, and the final offering of the day was there to assist that divine fire would never go out. Genesis 22, of course, does not single out this sacrifice because the offering Abraham makes is a one-time, non-repeatable affair, precisely what the tamid is not. But a typological reading need not be limited by such literalistic strictures. If the tamid is Israel's preeminent offering, and the binding of Isaac represents the deepest form of offering that could be asked of Abraham, it doesn't require a great deal of theological imagination to associate the two. The modern commentator Georg Steins and the medieval thinker Rabbi Chaste Kreskas come to very similar conclusions. Steins writes, the ram is representative of Isaac, that is, of Abraham's descendants and thus of Israel. In the context of the central texts on burnt offerings, there's a subtle interpretation of Israel's sacrifice. Genesis 22 narratively unfolds how it becomes possible for Israel's daily sacrifice to be Israel's self-sacrifice. And then continuing with Chaste Kreskas, which is text 5b on page 5. We'll come back to that. I couldn't give the handout in chronological order because I do go back and forth. Kreskas asserts that the fruits of the loins of the ram are offered by Israel, who is in turn the fruit of the loins of Isaac. So the tamid is a redoing, continual perpetuation, we might want to say, of Genesis 22, or the continual outgrowth of Genesis 22, Ram and Isaac, Ram and Israel. In this fashion, the daily offering is a substitute for the Jewish people, and when they bring the ram near to the altar, they will all be drawn near to the worship of the Lord. This is really hard to bring out in English. The word for sacrifice, lahakriv, means to bring something near. And sacrifice in the priestly document, that's what it is, bringing something near. And Kreskas plays on that. It's not my claim that this typological reading was intended by either the author of Genesis 22 or Exodus 29. Very important. So I'm not with Schmid. I'm with Childs. It's not, this connection is not at the level of composition of these texts. In all likelihood, these two stories were written independently of one another. Both make sense in their immediate literary environments and do not require the other to become intelligible. But when these texts become part of a single extended narrative, something that ancient interpreters were very good at, modern interpreters are terrible at, a narrative shaped by editorial verses designed to link passages like these, reading them in light of one another becomes almost unavoidable, unless you're a true believer in source criticism, and you can't break out of that mold. But for anyone who can have a kind of second naivete along the lines of Paul Ricoeur, it's impossible, I think, not to bring them together. For this reason, it cannot be accidental that the Aramaic Levi document, which I have on the handout, but we probably won't get to, number 4, our earliest commentary on the Tamid offering, 3rd century BC, grounds the Tamid sacrifice in the binding of Isaac. The Bible isn't even finished. We don't have the book of Daniel yet, and already these chapters are being drawn together by our earliest readers. For Childs, the key to understanding the intertextual relationship of these stories is to distinguish between individual textual witnesses and the shared theological substance that binds them together. That's the difference between he and Schmid. Because sacred scripture is ultimately inspired by God, it is incumbent on the reader to pursue a strategy of reading that can lay bare what texts like these can tell us about the nature of sacrifice itself, and not simply be limited to what the various individual textual witnesses want to say. Okay, my next section is on early interpreters. Aramaic Levi document, I'm going to leave that out for purposes of time. In question answer, if you're interested in what it does, I'd be happy to return to it. It's an incredible text. Isaac is both a priest and victim. He instructs Levi as to how to offer a sacrifice on the basis that he himself was the quintessential sacrifice. It's an extraordinary text. Anyways, going on. For now, we're going to skip over number 4. Q&A we can perhaps return. But let me just say this. One of our most ancient pieces of exegesis, which I've already said, the Aramaic Levi document follows this path. What I'd like to take up now is the paradoxical result that comes from this canonical join. What had been a sacrifice with no linkage to atonement becomes ultimately the paradigmatic mode of atoning for sin. Picking up here from my handout, let's see, where are we? We're on page 5, the very top, 5a. Section is Akedah as expiatory, and so the Tamid. The first text on the handout is from me, from my lecture. It becomes an expiatory sacrifice because it recalls the ultimate supererogatory act, a sacrifice than which no greater can be thought. Apologies to Anselm. In Jewish sources, the Akedah generates more merits than Abraham could ever possibly use. We'll return to a way in which that's found in Jewish sources. It redounds to the favor of Israel across generations. The 14th century Jewish thinker Chazdei Kreskas says precisely this, returning to him once more. It indeed appears, text number B5b, it appears fitting that this deed, which was a kindness to our entire nation, the descendants of Isaac, should leave its impress on them, even as it serves as a great aid to their preservation of their unique governance. It is as if these daily offerings are in exchange for all Israel, and in offering them, the entirety of the people are drawn near. Therefore, the daily offerings were lambs, which come from the ram, just as the nation as a whole is a descendant of Isaac. Well, where can we see any intimations in Scripture itself that the sacrifice of Isaac might have played this expiatory role? Here, let's turn to what Walter Moberly famously identified as the earliest commentary on the Akedah, the second angelic address, in which, maybe strikingly, especially for Protestant readers at this point, the covenant is grounded on the meritorious obedience of Abraham. The covenant is made initially, promised to Abraham in chapter 12 in a way that Luther would have loved, sola gratia. God calls Abraham prior to Abraham committing any act that would be worthy of his calling. But the covenant is refashioned famously at the end of Genesis 22, or the promise refashioned in a way that now grounds it in an act of human obedience. Reading then from Genesis 22:15, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I swear," the Lord declares, "because you've done this," Here's the grounding in the human action of obedience, repeating very much the language of Genesis 12, but deepening it by bringing Abraham's obedience into the equation. And have not withheld your son, your favored one, I will bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven. I have outlined their swearing and this notion of descendants as the stars of heaven, because we're going to see those elements picked up in Moses's argument for Israel's release from her sin in his mediatory prayer, which we heard about just an hour ago in Exodus 32, if you look down below. And we can also explain Exodus 32 even better by bringing Genesis 26 into the orbit, which is simply an extension of the promise made at the end of 22, where the promise also includes not simply making your descendants as numerous as the stars, but assigning to your descendants all these lands. These are all picked up when we get to Exodus 32, quite strikingly. Let's see. Sorry, I think I went too fast here. So the reason why I've highlighted these remarks in Genesis 22:15 in your handout, as well as 26:2, is what modern scholars have always realized is that the citation of the promise to the patriarchs that Moses makes when he appeals before God not to destroy his people as a result of their fashioning of the golden calf, they obviously allude back to Genesis. There's no doubting that. But what scholars have concluded over the last couple of decades is that they're not referring generally to promises made in Genesis, because the promises are made from chapter 12 to chapter 50 many times, but the diction is singular to the diction of promise associated with the near sacrifice of Isaac. So in terms of the diction, the language used in Exodus 32, many modern scholars have suggested, and I would certainly agree, that the promise to all the patriarchs is in view here, but the language used to expound that fact is derived specifically from the story of the Akedah. And then if we understand that as its background, then another piece of Jewish ancient interpretation becomes much more intelligible. Let's take a look in your handout to page 4, text 4c, just an astounding text in my mind from Leviticus Rabbah about the ram that's used for the Olah offering. It says there in Leviticus Rabbah, in the case of the ram, Scripture writes, he shall slaughter it on the north side in Hebrew Tzafona of the altar before the Lord. And then we get the rabbi's discussion of this. They said, when our father Abraham bound Isaac, his son, the Holy One, blessed be he, established the institution of the two lambs. There's the tamid grounded in Isaac's sacrifice, one in the morning and one in the evening. And what was the reason? The rabbis always wanted to ground this in the diction, sometimes very playfully and shockingly so in terms of what they would do. And it's clearly here, this is a good example of that. And for what reason? Because Israel would sacrifice the daily offering on the altar and recite this verse from Leviticus 1:11, which is how to offer a ram, which you have to do for the tamid. But they revocalized this word north side, Tzafona, as a passive participle, Tzifuna, meaning something hidden. The Holy One, blessed be he, would recall the binding of Isaac, perhaps his ashes, which were hidden there in the altar. And remembering those ashes, then he would forgive Israel, and remember Israel. I call on heaven and earth to witness against me. Whenever anyone, Gentile, Jew, man, woman, male or female slave, reads this text, you're reading it now today, think about that. Well, I'm reading it, but you can read it out loud afterwards, so then you will qualify for this benefit from the Talmud. The Holy One, blessed be he, will remember to your benefit the sacrifice of Isaac. right? So it's a rite that has eternal consequences. So ultimately, at least in my view, the inspiration of that midrash comes exactly from Moses' prayer of intercession in Exodus 32, understood in this midrashic fashion, that the merits accrued by Isaac's stupendous and Abraham and Isaac's stupendous sacrifice comes to the benefit of Israel. Okay, one question remains. We've seen that Moses here in Exodus 32 relies on the merits accrued by Abraham's actions. But how does Scripture itself understand Abraham's sacrifice? Let's turn to John Levinson, my favorite Old Testament scholar on this question, to get at that. That's text number 6 in your handout. And he writes here in one of his books, Abraham passes his great test only because he refuses to hold back his beloved son, only because he's willing to make even that donation painful beyond words. The great paradox is that because he proves willing to donate Isaac, he not only retains him, but to some degree merits the extraordinary promises that rest on his only favored son. Here, an analogy from the story of King Solomon suggests itself. When God appears to Solomon in a dream and announces, "Ask, what shall I grant you?" and the king asks for an understanding mind to judge your people, God responds with a double gift. He'll give him that wisdom, but he's also going to give him the riches and glory for which he did not ask. By continuing with Levinson, by preferring discernment to riches and glory, Solomon receives all three. By preferring the fear of God to Isaac and all that his beloved son signifies for his relationship with God, Abraham retains the son he did not withhold and receives all the promises that have long stood at the heart of his relationship with God. And this is the most important sentence. In the paradoxical, sacrificial logic of which this text is the outstanding Jewish example, it is our ungrudging willingness to give that leads to gaining and retaining what is most precious. Very important sentence. Essentially establishes the cruciform character of this action, if we were to translate this into Christian theological terms. It is in rising above self-interest. To gain your life, you must lose it, that we secure that which a calculus of self-interest can never yield or understand. For any Christian reader, the action being described here, I've already said, is fundamentally cruciform in nature. Only in giving does one receive. Embedded in the Akedah, we could say, is a figural anticipation of Christ's own sacrifice, nicely represented on the first page of your handout, the presentation of the Christ child in the temple, where strikingly we have our Old Testament priest before an altarpiece. Of course, altarpieces only exist in the church, but altarpieces in the church would have the crucifixion in the middle. That's what the offering of the sacrifice of the Mass is all about, representing Christ's sacrifice before the assembled congregation. But we can't have, at this point, Christ's sacrifice represented there. So what do we have? The binding of Isaac. A sacrifice, we might add, that has value even beyond the atoning purposes it has assumed in the economy of salvation. So the striking thing here is we began, you might remember, with Kloans, that the problem with interpreting the Tamid is that it doesn't fit into the atoning modality that most, especially Christian Old Testament scholars, want to fit all sacrifice. I agree with Kloans, that's exactly right. But ironically, reading the Tamid, in light of Genesis 22, atonement does come back into the picture, but it's important to emphasize that atonement is riding side saddle to the self-donation that the action itself is meant to instantiate. And I'll close with a citation of a 19th century German systematic theologian who I think expresses this very well. I must say, I wish I had known of Shaben before I'd written my book. Much of what I've given you today is from the last chapter of the book, but without Matthias Shaben. But let's close with what he says. The most perfect and effective glorification of God consists, admittedly, in sacrifice. Therefore, if the God-man is to promote the infinite glorification of God in the most effective and perfect manner as he can, he must offer to God a latroitic sacrifice, a self-donatory sacrifice of infinite value, very much along the lines of what Augustine does in City of God, Book 10, talking about Christ's sacrifice in a way that has nothing to do with atonement, but all about self-donation. The Philippians 2 theology of sacrifice, or Romans 12, if you want to have New Testament correlates. I say a latroitic sacrifice, for in latroitic sacrifice, the full capabilities and highest meaning of sacrifice are realized. It's also why in the sacrifice of the Mass, it's Christ who is sacrificed, represented before the congregation, but the congregation themselves is brought into Christ's sacrifice. We offer ourselves as part of the totus Christus, the whole Christ. But we're not offering ourselves as atonement sacrifices. We're offering ourselves in imitation of Christ's self-offering, right? That's what's going on there. And that's what Shaban here is trying to get at. I say a latroitic sacrifice. The full capabilities, highest meaning of sacrifice are realized. All other kinds of sacrifice are nested below it, right? We're not excluding them, but we're giving them their proper order, right? It's not that atonement is not there, it's there, but it rides underneath this more primary modality. The latroitic sacrifice achieves all the effects that can be attained by other species of sacrifice. So we don't see Genesis 22 as not about atonement in its own sense, but when we get to Exodus 32, it's the ultimate argument before God for atonement, the supererogatory act. The latroitic sacrifice character of Christ's sacrifice is not, as a rule, greatly stressed. Here in the economy of salvation, of course, the New Testament understands Christ's sacrifice primarily as a propitiatory sacrifice. That's what it accomplishes. But evidently only in the sense in which Scripture is accustomed to view the service of God in relation to the goods to be attained thereby. Indeed, we are of the opinion that even the propitiatory character of Christ's sacrifice can only be fully appreciated if its latroitic character is duly weighed. Okay, and then maybe just I'll explain a couple of other images in your handout that I didn't get to. We looked at the first page, which followed actually a trip to the UK. I saw that in person in the National Gallery and knew that had to go in my book. Unfortunately, it was also at the very end, so it's a footnote. I wish I could have included the image in my book, but it's a great image for my purposes. Then on page 7, we have an early 5th century synagogue mosaic from Sepphoris that is interested in the beginnings of cultic sacrifice. This is Leviticus 9, the Tamid sacrifice, which Aaron is about to offer, which is linked in the bottom panels there with the story of Isaac. So the two are represented as correlative, and you give a zillion of examples of these in Jewish materials. I'm just giving you two. If you turn to the last page, it's the frontispiece of a medieval text of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. And you'll see that the illustrator, chapter 1 of Leviticus, is the rules of offering for the olah, the sacrifice used for the Tamid sacrifice. And at the top of that page, in order to alert the reader as to how one would read Leviticus 1, you read it in light of the binding of Isaac, which is depicted there at the top. That's just everywhere in Jewish material. With that, I think I'll bring this talk to a close. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Gary, for that multimedia presentation. And I think we could kind of contemplate those things and possibly get distracted if we're not careful. But let's try and focus before lunch. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions that are arising. And just put your hand up so that I can see. Oh, first one from.
Thank you. There are a lot of arguments about incarnation anyway. The idea that God would have become man even if we had not fallen. Those seem to parallel your argument interestingly in that this sacrifice could have been offered all throughout creation history,
Bingo!
even if there had been
Oh my God!
no fall.
Exactly.
So for that
Did I
reason,
give you that question last night at dinner to ask?
you can give it to me tonight. Oh, I didn't know that. So I love that as a way of offering, sorry, pun, the constructive, positive framework for the whole system of offerings. On the other hand,
Where's the mic? Oh, this mic. So I guess what I would suggest, this is a classic medieval question. Duns Scotus, of course, would argue that yes, the incarnation would have happened, Thomas Aquinas not. But I think at least where my paper would point is that the incarnation and sacrifice, definitely sacrifice is constitutive of the identity of God. And yes, it would be there whether we sinned or not, but not an expiatory sacrifice, a latroitic sacrifice, right? Yeah. What Augustine in Book 10 of the City of God says a sacrifice essentially is. And so I think, the Old Testament in its way is a great witness to that. They couldn't find witnesses to it, explicit witnesses or convincing witnesses in the New Testament, but it's a good example of how the Old Testament, I think, can be a fundamental resource for Christological questions, something the fathers always knew. But I'm happy for your question on that, because that was, that's a favorite hobby horse of mine.
I stumbled on that happily. Okay, so all of that seems constructive and excellent, and I love it. Then I get worried that ordering might end up minimizing that which is ordered, so that the different elements of the sacrificial system might be inhibited from kind of emerging in their glory as they're actually used under the fall. So I guess it's Thomas's response to your intuition, even though none of that, yeah. So does this ordering run the risk of minimizing elements of the sacrificial system as they're needed under the conditions of the fall? And for that reason, the ordering is dangerous, even if correct.
No, I'd say, precisely not, because I think at least what I tried to argue in the paper is the paradoxical character of Abraham's action, at least as I've suggested in this paper, certainly the way in which these Jewish sources take it, is that it's the ultimately the most effective means of atonement, so that the ones that are ordered beneath, they don't lose their value. They're still part of what we study and attend to. But in terms of how they're ordered or nested, they are, at least in my opinion, of secondary significance. If we look at Leviticus, we looked at it earlier today, Leviticus 16, for example, the story of Yom Kippur, well, it's not identified as such, actually significantly in the canon, it's meant to correct the sin of Nadav and Avihu in Leviticus 10. According to the canonical ordering, one could ask the question, apart from that sin or apart from the sin of the golden calf, would the rite have been necessary? As a contrafactual, we can never know. But the way in which the text sets it up, it doesn't set up Leviticus 16 as though it were part of the permanent ordering of the cult. It becomes a necessary part in light of human sin, but it doesn't have the same theological weight as Exodus 29, right? So no, but that's all important, and I have passed over elements. If I was giving you a full fleshed, account of Christ's atoning sacrifice, there are a lot of other things I would want to bring into the mix. Only have 30 minutes. I only have this material. So yes, there are many other things that one would want to factor into the equation. I guess the thing I want to highlight is that the two things is that the expiation is not the summum bonum of the sacrificial cultus, and that in saying that, paradoxically, the latroitic sacrifice is the sacrifice that is the best mode of atoning. The self-offering, it's the self-offering of the Son. Like Philippians 2, where's the atonement there?
All right. So Leviticus 16 is not the heart of the Pentateuch.
I'm sorry?
Leviticus 16 is not the heart of the Pentateuch.
Leviticus 16?
Yeah.
Did you say? It certainly is. Well, what do you mean by the heart of the pentateuch?
Well, it's just that kind of thing, you know, coincidentally, it's round about the halfway point, isn't it?
Well, I think the halfway point is 9 and 10, at least according to the medieval counting of verses.
I'm not going by my own authority. I think it's like Eric Zenger or something.
Okay.
It said, you know, it was the heart of the Pentateuch.
No, actually, that's you mentioned it because you thought you would
just trying to get you to.
You would strike at me, but you actually contributed to my point because the medievals actually count in the words, and Leviticus 9 and 10 is where you're going to find them.
Ah,
and there's the Tamid.
There's a Tamid. Oh, well, okay. So the Tamid is the heart of the Pentateuch. So great. Good to have that clear. Joe Mangina.
Thank you, Gary. That was great fun as always. And so my question is very much adjacent to Adam's question. So to what extent or in what way does your analysis here with the latritic sacrifice and so on, and its relation to the propitiatory, how does it illuminate Protestant and Catholic intuitions about Eucharistic sacrifice and whether and what sense the church offers a sacrifice?
On the Protestant side, you'll have to answer that yourself. I don't know what to say. I love Hasde Kreskas, that the right way of relating the Akedah to the Tamid and then daily Jewish religious life. I think that's perfect, at least for how a Catholic would want to understand it, that Christ's sacrifice is a one-time Epiphax thing, but it's represented in the Mass, but it's not an inert thing. It's something that, as Benedict said in Deus Caritas Est, we're pulled into that action. We in the saying of the Mass, there are two invocations, at least in Eucharistic prayer 3, of the Holy Spirit. One, that God would come into the elements themselves, but the other that He would inspire us, come upon us to make us one with Him in that eternal sacrifice. And I think that's what's really beautiful. I mean, as a Catholic reading all of this, I think it's a beautiful outgrowth. We become one with His sacrifice, and we become one with His sacrifice not because it's primarily atoning, though it is atoning, but because it's the total donation of ourselves to God, right? And that's why the story of the rich young man in the Gospels, all the charity has such value. This is alluding to another book of mine, but because it's all a way of realizing self-sacrifice. You can't, not everyone can be a martyr, but anyone can give away all their money. The rich young man, Mother Teresa, there's St. Francis, that's within the ambit of anybody. And that's, participating in the self-donatory act of Christ. That's how it becomes salvific. It's not a work. In the way in which Luther would put it, or certainly Catholics wouldn't want to say that. It's something that's cruciform in character.
You sound like the best of ecumenical thought on this topic, actually.
Yeah.
Which needs to be received better. Thank you.
I mean, one of my favorite examples of this is like, so why is it not a work? Giving charity is like, if you're floating a boat on a canoe, floating a canoe on a river, you'd want to look in the river where the current was fastest if you wanted to make the best time, right? You'd put the boat in there, and that's kind of like charity is like this charmed act that God gives you. You do it, and then you're incorporated into Christ's sacrifice. It's like putting your boat in the fast stream. Boom, off you go, right? So it's not like this human work. I'm doing it, Gary Anderson, I'm so great. No, it's like God gave me this modality of participating in His grace. Why wouldn't I just jump in there and poof, be taken up?
I'd just like to pick up one aspect of that, possibly because it's May the 10th, and that's the birthday of Karl Barth. And that is the whole suggestion of merit. At one point, when you were talking about, I made an allusion to Luther. And I think that one of Luther's great reservations about what he had himself learned when he was in Erfurt and so forth was the fact that there was somehow in this action, I'm thinking Genesis 22, there was somehow Abraham merit something. And Luther can use the word merit, but never in the sense that it's classically been used. Mm-hmm. And I think also of a book was Christ's Death, Sacrifice by Marcus Barth. He spends quite a bit of time with Genesis 22. And the whole point is God provides. The provision doesn't come at all from Abraham from Abraham.
Right. I mean, what you're alluding, it's in the Catholic Catechism, is citation of Augustine, and crowning our merits, you're crowning your gifts, right? So that the whatever acts that we do that are meritorious are acts that were supercharged by your Holy Spirit in the first place.
I'm just thinking about the word merit at all. I think that is a one that is not helpful to understanding the text or in our theological.
So merit's the third rail. There's no question about that. As I wrote the essay, I worried about my audience. I guess where I would refer you to on this, and I don't pretend that you'd be convinced. You don't need to be convinced. You don't need to believe what I believe. I don't care. But my colleague at Notre Dame, Joseph Warwick, works on St. Thomas Aquinas, wrote a great article on merit in Calvin and Aquinas, in which he highlights the problem of merit, but he concludes that actually Calvin and Thomas are pretty much on the same page all the way down. Part of the problem that Calvin has when he rejects Aquinas is that Aquinas was taught in Calvin's day in a way that emphasized, humans' actions that didn't reflect Thomas's own mature thinking. But according to Joseph Warwick, any Protestant, I mean, I grew up in the Methodist tradition. Wesley talked about going on to perfection, which I'm sure would have sent, Luther into an apoplectic frenzy. Any Protestant thinker who is committed to the notion of sanctification, that grace actually does something, I think can find a place within a Catholic theology of merit to call their own. They might not like the word. I don't know, you can change the word, but the idea is definitely there. I can recall a colleague of mine when I taught at Harvard who talked about Puritans. This is if you're a Lutheran in the room now, you're going to really despise merit, Catholics, and maybe Calvin as well. He talked about the problem a lot of the Puritans had despair among congregants because they were always looking for the marks of their election. The marks, because they knew from Calvin, they were good readers of Calvin, this should make a difference. But they didn't, they were worried, they had great anxiety. This is, of course, Luther, the whole Reformation was to end that, right? To end that worry. But they worried about it. Why did they worry about it? Because, well, Calvin really did think that, I think grace makes a difference. And if grace makes a difference, then, you're in the world of merit. Well, I won't say any more than that.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. This idea of the self-donatory act, do you see this also in Adam before the fall? Why did God have to wait until Abraham to bring this out? And also, do you also see that somehow in the book of Revelation, this idea?
So, well, yes. I mean, actually, the book of Revelation is probably, I guess this text is problematic. But I think it's in chapter 13, it refers to Christ as the lamb slain before the foundation of the world, right? Isn't it? You're all Protestants, you should know. Isn't it Revelation 13? There we go. But there's one Protestant in the room, Mr. Mangina. So there you go. So this sacrifice, I think, has to be seen as part of the inner Trinitarian life that is expressed in the economy of salvation in a propitiatory form. But because it's part of the I would call the inner Trinitarian relations, it precedes chronologically the fall. As to Adam, well, then I guess I would say who is a famous English critic who remarked about Milton's Paradise Lost that the only interesting character in the work was Satan. Who is that guy? The scholar? He taught at BU, I think. Can't remember his name now. Anyways, it's because I'm getting older. I can remember everything about a person. I don't like being, chained to a mic. I despise that, but I try to stay in front of the mic. So what he said, this scholar, and I'm blanking on his name now, I think he was one of the first kind of deconstructionists. He went to Duke. No one can help me. Stanley Fish, there we go. Thank you, Stanley Fish, there we go. But it's very hard to create a compelling narrative about life before the fall. We can't imagine it. It's not, life after the fall is very easy to narrativize. And you can see this play out many ways. My wife and I love watching this summer this show, Turkish show, Black Money Love. Great love relationship between Omar and Elif. Won't go into it. But the only disappointing part of the show is that when Omar and Elif finally put aside all the things that were, thwarting their love relationship, when they were actually just with one another, the show kind of sagged. You were hoping for this all the time because they're such a beautiful couple. But what are they supposed to do when, all the evil's gone and they're just there? I mean, it was nice for a few minutes, and then you thought, ick, this is boring. Let's get some more trouble in the way that they have to evacuate. I think that's kind of Stanley Fish's point too. Yeah, Satan's much more interesting, but it's almost impossible for this side of the fall to narrate, the pre-fall existence in a way that's, compelling to a reader. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I would say.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. I'm just curious if you've given thought to the presence or allusion or reference to Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac, in Paul's letter to the Romans, Romans 8:32, but also in Romans 11, where it is clear that, or it's debatable if in fact the rejection of the unbelieving branch is broken off, they're stumbling, and there's future inclusion means the, I'm sorry, I'm a bit nervous here.
Yeah, that's right.
The redemption, what more will their acceptance be but life from the dead? And so I'm just curious if you've done any work in this area or have given it any thought.
So Romans 11, no. Romans 8, other parts of the Pauline correspondence, I think, do allude to the binding of Isaac. There's a very famous professor at Yale. You might have known him, Joseph. Niels Dahl, was he there when you were there? Wrote, I think, compellingly, but they're all disputed passages. If they're alluding to, for example, I think the baptismal announcement, "This is my beloved son," is Genesis 22, but you could also say Isaiah. There are other places you could point. None of them are what we would call, smoking guns. That's a terrible image. But I'm from the United States. Everyone's got a gun, so it's a smoking gun. I think canonically, certainly they have to be connected. Whether at the compositional level, did Paul himself think this? Did when the synoptic gospel writers recount the baptismal speech of God? Is that what they're thinking? I guess I'm enough of a modernist. I would want to say there's room for doubt, but as a canonical reader, I think it's definitely an appropriate point of conversation between the two texts.